Hey guys, so today we're just looking at a little project that my partner and I have been working on for the last 14 months, and it's gone through many evolutions, but we're still in the beginning stages of learning about different systems and different ways of growing things, and it's a obviously ongoing project, but we were interested, like Toby said, that he wanted to film some and just get some of the content of like what we've done here so far, and I think it's at a good stage now that we could show where we're up to and hopefully maybe even do a follow-up video and see how it evolves over time. This zone here is basically our annual garden, so we're mainly rotating annual crops, the things that you really want in your kitchen. And so the stuff that requires, I guess, more maintenance and that you want on a daily basis. And then we've kind of moved all the perennials out of the garden into the food forest and our bigger system.
And just to put it into perspective for the people watching, there is the kitchen in there, and there is kale, carrot, some broccoli right at the back door. And it's amazing because you can be cooking food and then just pick what you need right there.
Yeah, so at the moment we've just got one long row of beds, and then we've kind of moved everything else. Like we've got the tomatoes in the back corner there, which we'll probably go down to in a second. And we've also got our chickens on the other side of the house, which is we're slowly incorporating into our system. And if we come down here, we're very lucky to be on our own creek. So most of the water that supplies the garden comes from a creek, but it flows down to the bottom of the hill and then gets pumped back up. And yeah, it makes a little microclimate, a little oasis here. And we're very fortunate to have that there. And so over here, we got chickens, which we only put in about maybe 2 months ago, and we've given them a little run so they have a bit more space.
Cool.
And in the box there, we create all our compost.
Oh, so all of your food scraps go into there,
Yep.
and then the chickens turn it up and compost it for you, right?
Exactly. And so we started off with 6 chickens in this space, but then we've given them the run, and I'm still figuring out how I want to incorporate doing compost in this section, maybe on a bigger scale. But so far, I'm just letting them dig around in that space.
And it is very windy.
Very windy today.
Oh, there's the automatic door you were talking about as well.
Yep. So on Amazon, $70, gets your automatic door, solar charged. You can set it to open and close or do it with a remote. And that's pretty handy for keeping the chickens from getting eaten at night, but as well as being able to let them out without having to give yourself another daily task.
So you think if you were to redo this chicken coop, you would have some sort of rotation system where this area here can be in different plots, so the chickens always have access to fresh grass? Or
Yeah, I mean, here we were limited to the space, and obviously we wanted to keep it very close to the house. So that's why we went with this system. But yeah, I think ideally, if you had some sort of, rotational grazing and you could grow crops up, maybe 4 paddocks, grow them up, basically, once you spend a week in each plot, I think that would be the ideal system for getting feed very low. And also, obviously, I planted all sunflowers in this, but obviously within 2 or 3 days, they'd knocked them all down. And obviously it doesn't recover if they're in there all the time. So I think some sort of rotational system would be good, especially for, I guess, off-grid applications where you don't want to rely on feed. I think that would be ideal. And then we do a little bit with worms. So I've just built my own worm farm there.
this little bucket system.
And so I'm just stacking pots at the moment. And yeah, pretty much just doing the same food scraps in there, and then rotating it, but there's quite a lot in here, but I think they've probably gone down to the bottom. But it's a good way, and I think I'll continue to scale that because it's just whatever comes out of a worm farm is just absolute gold for the garden.
The juice at the bottom there, looks like if it'll focus. And every backyard could have one of these, right? Like, you could recycle all of your kitchen waste and turn it into worm juice.
Totally, and we started off, we were living in near the beach in Coolum, and we knew we weren't going to stay at that property for very long. So I started off just with a worm farm and a bunch of sort of 50-litre pots that I was growing herbs in. And all of this has kind of just been scaled up from there. But that was a way we could actually move the garden with us until we had a more substantial place to do it. And yeah, we've got some passion fruits growing over this arch here, and we have a bunch more on the bigger arch over there.
One question I wanted to ask is, a lot of gardeners struggle with crop rotation and when to plant different crops at certain times. So like, you know, there's the whole, obviously you can't plant the same crop after you've planted that crop.
Yeah.
What sort of system do you use here?
At the moment, I'm just kind of doing like the 4 seasons. Well, I guess in the tropics, you can grow things most of the year round, which I guess complicates it. So at the moment, I'm just kind of doing like a winter crop and then kind of a summer, spring crop. And I think like I'm mainly focusing on things that we use all the time. So I think I'm always doing like carrots and kale and things that you could grow almost all year round in the subtropics. And then yeah, just like things that kind of just taking off the lowest hanging fruit off our grocery bill, really.
Right.
So as terms of a crop rotation, I don't have a system fully, but I'm kind of just interplanting to try and get more and more out of the beds, and then just trying to keep like maybe the top 10 or 15 things that we eat the most, that we incorporate in most of our food, and then obviously moving towards like more specialty items and just going for the biodiversity. But I just try and keep, pretty much my only principles at the moment is to keep the beds always covered. So I always have like sugar cane or something on top of the soil, and then I just try and keep things growing in it all the time. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, always keep the soil covered, and even if there isn't anything growing in it, I still keep it irrigated, just so obviously whatever's in the soil continues to go even when there's no plants in it. Because I think as soon as the soil gets exposed to the sunlight and dries out, you can literally see it like dying, you know. Soil turns to dust.
If we come to the soil here, if you have a look at it, underneath it's quite moist with all this mulch on it. And if that was, you know, if there was no mulch, it was just soil, that would be fully dry, right? Like,
yeah, definitely. And so yeah, and we obviously, like every time we clear out a bed, we will add another layer of compost on top of that, and then add some form of mulch. And most of the time we're using either like some sort of straw or a sugarcane kind of mulch, because it breaks down pretty fast, and it also just suppresses the weeds, especially in the early stages. Like as the plants get quite dense, the weed issue kind of goes away. But obviously when you put seedlings in the ground, weeds grow much faster than them.
yep.
And so if we work our way down here, this is kind of like which leads to our bigger system. So on this side here, we've pretty much just planted a bunch of like perennials, and I've got a bit of dragon fruit growing, and I've just been slowly layering this bed off the soil because it was pretty poor soil. So I've put a bit of mushroom compost, and then as well as leaves, and just covering that bed more and more. And I've got a bit of type of, I think it's Brazilian spinach, which is a perennial kind of spinach.
Yep.
And I'm planting sunflowers in between that as a kind of chop and drop. So I want to let them go when they're getting close to seeding, then we'll chop them down and we'll probably mulch over the top of them and just keep adding those biomass layers.
Yep.
On this side, we've just got a bit of mint in there, and then the rest is all sweet potatoes, and they just make a beautiful ground cover because they just grow so dense, and I'm kind of keep training them into the bed so that they continue to just cover that ground, and we'll get a harvest of sweet potato sometime later in the year.
Cool.
And down here, we kind of just reset this bed. We were growing a lot of Queensland arrowroot and a bunch of different beans, but now we've kind of reset it. So I want to get more beans for the trellis, and we're going to grow, we've planted, maybe if you come a bit closer you can see,
Yep.
but we've planted a bunch of zucchinis, both the gold ones and the black ones. And yeah, I'm going to try and vertically grow them for the first time. So put them up to a stake and grow them vertically to save space. And also, I think I've heard that the more you keep them off the ground, the less they are prone to like soil bearing diseases.
Yep.
So we're going to give that a go. And obviously that gives us a nice big open area here to plant something else, and
Yep.
as well as, like, again, optimizing all the vertical spaces.
Yeah, and one really cool thing about this garden is you've got the home here, and there's not many open spaces. Like, every space has been used quite efficiently, I've noticed. Like, there's pumpkins growing out of this corner here, there's plants everywhere. Like, it's very efficient.
Yeah, and I think that, like, the permaculture principle to use all the borders makes a lot of sense, especially in small spaces. Because yeah, I think it's the only way to really get high production out of a small space is by utilizing and, I guess, layering a garden, and yeah, kind of using the prime spaces for all the kind of temperamental things that need those, like the sunlight, and then obviously layering in other things to get a higher production. And on this bed in particular, I just went to the bottom of the hill and just raked up a whole bunch of leaves, and it's just full of leaves and twigs. But again, just covering the ground, just keeping the ground covered at all times. And even if you dig in it, you can see all the bugs that actually break down all these leaves, and they're all just creating an ecosystem in there. So, and you can see again, keep the ground wet. We did have some rain pretty recently, but as long as you keep the ground damp and covered, you're not going to interrupt that cycle
Yep.
of insects.
Awesome.
And so here is the bigger system.
That's cool.
So we've kind of, this system I think is probably coming on to about maybe 6 months now. So this was all just a giant paddock, and they've kind of mowed it down, and then we've added in a big lot, like this, the soil here in, I guess, South Queensland is, it's quite heavy clay. So because of things like avocados that like the drainage, we actually piled the dirt quite high to try and get the drainage. And then we just covered it with a whole lot of mulch, like a kind of composted double ground mulch that breaks into soil. And maybe if you come and look over here, you can see that on the surface it remains as mulch, but as soon as you start to dig, like this is, again, like I said, probably 6 months. It's pretty dry in this spot, but you can see it's already starting to break into like soil. Yeah, it's already starting to become like soil. And so yeah, we've basically got a big mound of like pretty heavy clay, and then we've just covered it with that. And then ideally we would want to cover it with another layer. And that's why I've started to do kind of cover cropping, especially with sunflowers. So this section here, I grew a big kind of a mixed cover crop of like daikon radishes and oats, and just a mix that I bought, and we just knocked it all down, and you can already see it just creates some cover for the soil. And I found that, like, the soil being quite dark obviously attracts the sun, attracts heat, so it does get pretty dry. So I'm finding that the more you keep layers on top of it, the more it keeps it damp, and I guess also it reflects the sun a bit more with having like a lighter thing like hay or sugarcane on top of it.
And the first thing I noticed is it's just so lush out here. Like, there's so much going on.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely been a learning experience, and I mean we're pretty fortunate that a lot of the plants are growing pretty nicely. Like as you zoomed in on those like eggplants, we're also starting to get like capsicums. So we've got little bell capsicums there, and yeah, we haven't got any bananas out of this system in particular, but we've got another system down the bottom of the hill that's already producing bananas.
So if you were to restart this Syntropic system, would you do it any differently, or do you think you would kind of double down on what you've already got going on here?
Well, I think this started off more as just like a kind of conventional food forest, and now we're transitioning into syntropics with interplanting more things for biomass, because I think that's where syntropics is set apart from other systems, is just the creation of biomass. And I think with that, I would have, as soon as we actually did the foundational work for the soil, I would have cover cropped the entire bed and let that grow up, and then I would have chopped that down, and that would have started, I think, a lot better than we kind of grew most of the trees out in pots, and then we planted them into it, and then there was pretty much just trees and bare soil around it, and I think that slowed the whole process down quite a bit. And I think like certain like seedlings that we put on the sides of this would just get baked because of the like immense sun in the part of the world we live in, and the fact that it's quite dark, obviously the mulch. So I think it just attracted too much heat and just dried out too much, and that inhibited a lot of the growth on the sides. So I think we would have been better off going with something that's a lot hardier of a cover crop and growing that just to get something in the soil before we followed with all the plants that have a bit lower temperament.
Yep.
Yeah. So at the moment we're growing mainly sunflowers, so you'll see thousands of sunflowers because that's what we're using mainly for the biomass. But we're also interplanting sugarcane, the bananas primarily for biomass, just because they grow so quickly, and the amount of like suckers, the little shoots they send up, just work really well for creating biomass. Because obviously, like each one of these that you cut out and put back to the soil is just giving more for the microbes to feed on.
Yep.
We also use like cranberry hibiscus, which grows prolifically and is perfect for chop and drop because it grows into a big hedge and quite hardy. And yeah, you can chop it down, add it back to the soil. And that's kind of where we're getting is like, I guess the faster you can get that cycle to happen from when things are growing and things are returning to the soil, the faster the system works for building up those layers and building more and more mass into the soil. And the more fungal and microbe activity there is in the soil, the more things the more resilient the system is as a whole.
So it seems like finding plants that almost grow like weeds, so that when you do start planting in the mound, there isn't bare soil because things are just growing so quickly and so vigorously. Like these sunflowers are probably a good example of that, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they serve multiple purposes by being there. But even just, I found like that even just having roots in the ground does a whole lot. Like if you take a piece of like barren ground and you try and plant something in it, it seems like it's quite hard for the plant to establish itself. But if you planted a more hardier plant in that soil and then you planted a plant next to it that's more temperamental or less resilient, I think it just has an easier time. Like first having something in the soil first. I think what the sunflowers are doing, besides like creating a lot of nitrogen stuff to go back to the soil, is also they are just kind of creating those relationships with the soil, so when the next plants go in, they don't have to break in the soil. And the cool thing about this system is, I guess, the more that you can do propagations, the more you can kind of just keep interplanting with the plants that are already in the system. So a lot of things like cassavas, and these, even the cranberry hibiscus, and a lot of like the leafy green kind of plants. So you can just take clippings off, and then you can just keep planting them and just making the system more and more dense. And that way, yeah, you can cut a lot of cost out of, you know, having to plant the hundreds of plants it takes to create a system.
And this isn't much space actually. Like, do you think this is something that could be in most backyards?
Yeah,
This strip of trees?
definitely. Yeah, and I mean, this is only at a very low stage of its density, because obviously we don't really have a canopy as such yet. But yeah, I mean, and the space between this, we kind of left the space quite big, just because we had the space, and to create like maybe a nice area. I'm sure we'll have picnics here
Yeah.
when we do get that canopy. But yeah, you could also, like, if you squish this down a little bit, and brought these tree rows a bit closer, you could fit this in a very small space. And I think that's what we've also been learning through this process is how much food you can actually get off a system. And I think the biggest learning curve that I've taken is from starting a small garden and then scaling up is the need to become like a lazy farmer, in the way of you can't 10 times the size of the system and then 10 times the input that you're putting into it. It just becomes unfeasible at a certain point. So I think the question becomes like, how can you grow more food with less effort? And I think this system is becoming that, because we're putting like a fraction of the amount of effort into it, and we're just kind of letting it go for the most part, and then just having to intervene only where we have to, and kind of maybe periodically throughout the year, instead of having the daily maintenance of an annual garden.
How much time do you think you would spend on one of these rows every week?
I mean, I don't actually have an irrigation system in this, because it shouldn't need one in the future. Obviously, we have quite a wet season where it rains a huge amount, and obviously the more we grow a canopy and the less precipitation, I guess, comes off, or evaporation comes off the ground, we should actually be able to do away with irrigation. But I would say, besides the fact that I sometimes come out here and water, especially like things that are beginning to struggle, I reckon I'd spend less than 2 or 3 hours a week on this entire garden.
Wow.
Because I'm pretty much just coming through to do, just to kind of stop certain plants from getting shaded out by other plants. And yeah, we're pretty much obviously very minimal with any kind of intervention that we need, because we don't want to also create a system that needs lots of intervention. So I think the more you just let it do its own thing, the more you can, it gets kind of used to being neglected, in the way that it, yeah, you just allow it to do what it wants to do, naturally wants to do, and you create it in such a way that it doesn't require you to intervene all the time.
So you would recommend this style of farming, style of gardening, should I say, to an avid backyard gardener?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like pros and cons to different systems, and this system, I mean, some people would say it's quite messy, because obviously you're letting a lot of things grow, and plants eventually do begin to fight more and more as the system grows. And you're also getting a less of a harvest off each plant, because they do eventually start to fight for sunlight and resources. So there would be, like, if you planted these at perfect spacing and you gave them full sun, you're going to get the most out of them, which eventually, as you get a canopy, you get less and less. But I think just the fact that the maintenance is a lot lower, especially in situations where you're not home all the time and you can't spend, huge amounts of hours per week in it. I would say this system is definitely like the best for your average backyard grower that wants to grow a lot of food with a little effort. I think this is about as close as I've found of a system to achieve that.
Awesome. Syntropics.
Yeah, I think for now our priority is just to keep obviously adding plants to this system and keep feeding those fruit trees until they can get tall enough that they create that top canopy.
Yep. It's a cool comparison with the grass here. It's like a typical Australian backyard. This is probably a average Australian backyard size compared to this, you know, I could see this in every backyard in Australia, and the amount of food that you'd get from this, how much pressure that would take off the, you know, the commercial farmers.
Yeah, and I think the other benefit to this is obviously we've got a lot of like avocados and mangoes and papayas, although papayas produce fruit and bananas produce fruit pretty quickly, but a lot of the trees like the citrus that you'll have to wait a few years for until you're getting an abundance of, you also are getting other crops out of the system already. So like, as you saw, we're already getting lots of things like tomatoes and lots of eggplant, and we're getting a lot of leafy greens and stuff out of this system already. And this system's probably, like I said, probably about 6 months old.
Yep.
And so you get all those things out of it while it's growing. And I think that's the key to this system is planting things that you can get almost an immediate harvest from as you're waiting for the fruit trees to take off. Because I guess if you plant out an orchard, a lot of citrus is like 5 years, and you can work with grafted trees. A lot of these trees are grafted, just try and speed them up, but you're still waiting multiple years for till you can kind of completely knock these kinds of vegetables and fruits and stuff off your grocery list.
Right.
So I think the fact that you can get a harvest all the way from probably the first few months all the way up until you have fruit trees, I think is also another key to this system. All right, so this basically had an existing row of trees that were quite neglected that we did a whole bunch of pruning on, just kind of bring them back into shape. And then we added this other row. So this has a lot of quite young fruit trees as well as the bananas. And these bananas have probably been in the ground for, I'd say probably 6 months, and we're already getting some bananas out of them. They've just grown prolifically. And I think fortunately, because of the age of the soil and how, even though it was neglected, it had been pretty covered by leaves. The soil in these beds was quite established, and I think that was of benefit to everything we've planted in here since. So the idea is eventually we'll use some of this space between the tree rows to grow more biomass.
Yep.
The bananas are kind of at the moment acting as biomass as well as giving us another crop. And we've placed a beehive just over there in the paddock, so that is hopefully improving the germination of this orchard, because we have basically this old mango tree here would basically give about 1 mango a season. And we have a few theories about it. Our main theory is that it wasn't being able to pollinate off other mango trees, and that was what led it to just not really pollinate properly. So hopefully with the addition of the bees and other fruit trees and a lot of mango trees pretty close by,
Yep.
we should actually see a better pollination. And hopefully if we can get that big fruit tree, like that giant mango to fruit, that would be already a huge addition to the system.
And this looks really cool. It's almost like a little jungle.
Yeah, and so there's pretty thick sugar cane covering the ground,
It's very soft.
which is suppressing all the weeds.
Awesome. Oh, and there's that example of chop and drop right there.
Yeah, exactly.
So banana leaves get chopped off, put around the base of this citrus, free mulch.
Yeah, exactly. And banana trees are really good because wherever you dig around them, there's always lots and lots of worms. And I think that's just because of how they interact with the soil. Obviously, they hold a lot of water around the corum, around the base of them, and that creates a great environment for worms. So I think obviously we're limited like to the area, and they grow really well in the tropics and the subtropics, but I see almost everyone's food forest system incorporating those in the tropics, just because they, like I say, they bring the worms, and they also just the speed in which they grow. You're getting multiple kilos of biomass every year from them, and they're also adding a lot to keep a lot of moisture in the system. And I've seen a lot of people, when they chop them down, they actually only cut them halfway, and they allow all the moisture from the stem to trickle back into the corum, which helps the other bananas grow and also puts that back in the soil in a slow manner. So it's good over summertime.
Yep.
Well, here it rains a lot in summertime, but over winter time.
Yep. Yeah, this is a pretty cool close-up of what a banana looks like on the inside, actually. It's quite dense, holds a lot of moisture. That's what the inside looks like.
Yeah, and you can really see that we're getting bananas. That's a good example there.
Oh, cool.
And there's a bell on this one too that's going to grow bananas.
So, cool point we just found out. The house is over there. Chris was saying that he tried to plant out this garden bed, and as you can see, it's got some weeds growing.
Yeah, well,
but not much is going on, and you were saying that's because of the distance from the house. It became a little bit difficult to manage.
Yeah, and I mean, because we have so much close to the house, this bed was always kind of last in line for maintenance, and so it did give us a relatively good harvest of like rock melons and watermelons and things like this, a lot of the bigger things that we didn't plant in our garden. But yeah, it got out of hand. We ended up just running a slasher blade through it, and now it's just growing into weeds. We will eventually plant this out, but again, I think to keep certain things close to the house is definitely a key point, because to walk down here every day and to tend to this was just never a priority, and so the bed shows that.
All right, we're back at the home garden. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, if you could do this garden over with the knowledge that you have now, would you do it differently, or what would you change?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it has evolved quite a bit from when we started. I think I would have optimized it earlier on for irrigation, just because hand watering through the drier seasons becomes quite a task, and it adds up. Like, it seems like if you have one garden bed, it's not too bad, but as soon as you add 3, 4, 5, it begins to become quite a task just to water it. So I think I would have optimized it for watering better on, and maybe even just run some sort of a dripper system and then run my crop rows for that. And I think I also would have just come up with better supports to the system, in terms of, like, I would have started composting more earlier on and using more resources from around the property. Like, we started off by basically taking apart a fence and building our garden beds, and now I've actually simplified a lot, going down to literally just laying logs, mulching the pathways, and then doing everything in a more simplistic way. So I think I would have simplified things. I would have started off much more simple, and I would have started off smaller. I think if I started with one garden bed and focused on that more before I expanded, I think I would have saved myself a lot of work later down the track, reworking these beds and yeah, just reworking the whole system as a whole would have been easier the smaller it was. So I think I would have I would have optimized it for irrigation earlier on, and I would have simplified it. I think those would be the two things I would have done first.
And compost.
Yeah.
Cool. And how old are these logs as well?
Pretty old. Like, I mean, I just kind of go into the forest in front of us and I take down the logs that are either flowing down the stream or have, died and starting to get eaten out by termites. But I think it is a nice way to get semi-raised garden beds, at least create borders without the expense of building raised garden beds, because that does add up because originally we had sort of beds a similar height to that, but as we kept piling up the pathways with mulch, they basically began to get buried, and they acted less and less like a raised garden bed. And I mean, this system, I feel like it just looks natural. It's simple. They're easy to replace. You can pull one out and put another one in as they rot out, and the whole time they're getting eaten out by the fungi that's in the mulch, that's breaking down the mulch. So they're just becoming another part of the system. So they actually, I think the hardest thing with gardens is the outdoor exposure is not like kind to things. And so obviously the better materials you use, the longer it lasts, but that also adds up.
Of course.
So it's almost cool in a way if you can incorporate natural things that you just replace over time. Like these logs, they'll sit there for quite a few years, I imagine. And as they break out, they'll just return to the soil, and we'll just put a new one in. And we've got an endless supply from the forest. So I think it's a good way of not going all colour bond and spending all the money to do that, but still create some neat borders.
Cool. Well, thanks for showing us around, Chris.
No worries.
This is how we're meant to live, guys. Start gardening. Start a garden bed.